session. My name is Linda Pantel, and I work with the Alumni Career Development team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. I'm delighted to welcome you today to How to Write a CV, Academic Best Practices. Today we will hear from Briana Konnick. Briana is an Associate Director of Graduate Career Development at the University of Chicago in UChicago grad. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Briana.
Thanks so much, Linda, and welcome everybody who is listening and watching along at home. And for those of you in central or farther along timelines, good afternoon and good morning to those of you who might be behind us in time zone. So as Linda said, my name is Briana Konnick. I am Associate Director of Graduate Career Development at the University of Chicago, and I support all of our graduate students and postdocs in the STEM fields on campus. A little bit of my background, just so you know who you're hearing from today. I have, my undergrad was from Vanderbilt University. I then did my PhD in virology from the Scripps Research Institute and did a short postdoc there as well. However, years ago, I transitioned over to providing career and professional development for advanced degree holders. So I have been doing this for about 4.5 to 5 years now and have quite a bit of experience presenting and advising people on the academic job market, as well as all of the various materials within those applications. So today we're going to be focusing on the academic CV or Curriculum Vitae, and this is really a central document for all applications in regarding for academic employment, but also for funding specific types of awards as well as fellowships. So before we get started, I have a quick poll just to see what everyone is here for, to get at what you're actually wanting out of the next hour of discussion. So Linda, if you could go ahead and send out the poll, please fill that out. Just select what makes the most sense as to why you're here today. So we'll allow that to go for a few minutes, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what has brought everyone here.
Great, thank you everyone for these responses. I'm still seeing a few more come in.
And as those are coming in, I do want to just give kind of an overall caveat for today's topic, in that we are talking about an academic document. So in different countries, what a CV means can differ. So everything that we're going to be going over today is within the United States context of what a curriculum vitae is utilized for. So this is for things like applying to graduate programs, but also for postdoc positions and faculty positions, or other types of academic awards or funding mechanisms. So hopefully that gives you some basic foundation of understanding the context in which we'll be discussing this particular document today.
Thanks, Bree. Looks like we have about 50% of folks who have never made a CV and want to know what this document is. 20% who it's been a while and would like refresher. We have about 10% in the other categories of actively applying, having very specific questions answered or other.
Fantastic. Okay, so we will have a time at the end for more questions from the audience, and Linda will be monitoring that as we go through the content today. So if there are particular things that I'm not explaining well enough, go ahead and put those questions into the chat box. If we don't get them to them during the actual workshop, we'll make sure to have them at the end for the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I know that we have a wide variety of disciplines represented in attendees today. So one just word of caution, and that the norms for academic CVs, they really do vary from discipline to discipline. So I have put through this workshop a variety of asterisks that will indicate field-specific advice, in which I'm basically going to say you need to check with the norms of your own discipline or the disciplines in which you are applying into. So you would check with advisors, previous mentors, or people that are currently in the types of positions you're hoping to apply for, to get some of those norms understood as you create or update your document. So what we'll be going over today is really 4 main points. The first portion is to talk about what the role of a CV actually is. What does this document do for you? And what does it actually not do? So the limitations, but also the power of the CV. We'll then work into a little bit of foundations around formatting because as people read your CV, we want to make sure that it is as easy for them to read as possible, especially if you are actively applying to any positions. We don't want to give a reader or an employer a reason to discard your document just because it's poorly formatted. So we will talk about formatting and then work into the specific sections in terms of content. So what are some very typical sections of an academic CV and some best practices for how to put those together. We'll then walk through at the very end a few final steps as you create, craft, update this document. So to get us started, let's talk a little bit about the power of the CV. So this is a great quote from Joshua Eiler through The Rhetoric of the CV. He says, when you send in your job application materials, you're not just assembling separate documents to fulfill the requirements of a job ad. Those documents are part of a larger rhetorical whole, and together they form an argument for the viability of your candidacy for a particular job. So what this really means is that the CV, especially when you're thinking about academic applications for faculty positions, you are going to be submitting several different documents for those types of applications. And so the CV is just one part of the entire whole, and each document has different roles. So that's what we're going to be chatting about today. So what is a CV? The CV is really the cornerstone of all applications for academic employment, grants, fellowships. It also follows you if you're applying to faculty positions and going up for tenure. So when you apply to a position, it's first going to be evaluated by a search committee, and then it will be revisited throughout the entire hiring process. So it is a document that needs to speak to who you truly are as an academic, as a researcher, as a teacher. It is a ticket to a tenure track job in the competitive job market. So what can and what cannot this document do? So a good CV should be effectively communicating your productivity as both a researcher and a teacher. Again, this depends on the type of role that you're thinking about going into as to how you structure this document. But overall, the academic CV is meant to be a repository of everything that you've done academically. So that means every course that you've taken, taught, all of your research, the projects that you've had, publications, any field work that you've done, again, depending on your discipline. So it really needs to communicate your productivity, your impact. What have you actually accomplished? In and of itself, it is enough information to convince a search committee to really delve into the other application materials. So if you are applying to a faculty position, does that mean that you'll be sending in a teaching statement? Well, they're going to look at your CV, see generally what the overall impact of your teaching has been, and then that might convince them to read the other documents more in detail. It can, in and of itself, put you on the interview shortlist. So it can, when search committees are evaluating this document, they're really looking for, where were you trained? What is your disciplinary focus and specialties? What have you actually accomplished? What has been the output of you as an academic? And the CV really does need to speak for you throughout the entire process. So the entire job application process. It is used not only to actually apply to positions, but it will be revisited as you're going through the interview process. So there are a few things, however, that the CV cannot and really should not be doing. So the first part is something that I've already touched on a little bit, in that every discipline has different expectations for this document in terms of the order, in terms of the organization, even the level of detail of how you describe the different experiences that you've had. So a good CV, it can't diverge from the conventions expected of your discipline, and it can't really go out of the bounds of what this document is meant to do in the first place, which is what we'll be talking about today. We want to make sure, as you are putting all of your academic activities into this document, that it it's genuine. We're not going to distort, we're not going to pad things of adding extraneous detail that maybe is not actually meant to go into the CV. And I think when we move into the content portions, you'll see what I mean a little bit more with this particular aspect. The other thing about a CV is that there's actually no page limit. So an academic CV, again, in the US job market, there's no page limit for this. This is just meant to be a repository of every academic activity that you've had. So with that, it can be an incredibly long document. I have seen some full professors, that have been in the field for 40 years, whose CVs are 60 pages in length because of the amount of publications and productivity that they've had, all of the speaking engagements, things like that. So we can't really expect everyone to read the entire document. So making sure that we understand what's the most important for the types of positions you're applying to and how to order your CV is going to be quite necessary to kind of grasp for how to craft this document. If you are thinking about applying to positions where you will be putting in other types of application materials along with the CV, a good CV can't accommodate or compensate for weak application materials. They absolutely will be looking at the rest of your application package and want to make sure that those materials are just as well tailored and polished as the CV is. In and of itself, the CV cannot land you a job. So it can get you on the interview shortlist, but you will have to discuss and effectively communicate what your accomplishments are and why you fit that particular role during the interview process. So as search committees are looking at this document, one of the many questions that I receive is, what do committees actually evaluate? What do they care about? What do they look at first? So a little bit depends on the type of position that you're applying to and what discipline you're in. However, they're really evaluating a handful of things. So first and foremost, have you published? Has that been a part of your academic journey so far? And for people that might be just undergraduates or undergraduate alumni that are attending this workshop today, there's not necessarily an expectation that you would have published from your undergraduate work, but from PhDs, from postdoc, absolutely publications are an expectation. They also might look at what level of impact have these publications had in terms of what journal they've been in. They will be looking at the basic information of where you did receive your degree or postdoctoral training, if that's applicable for your field. Do you have teaching experience? What kind of teaching experience was it? And overall, were you consistently productive at every stage of your academic training? They will also assess if you have won any awards, if you have been applying to things. And then overall, they want to get a good grasp in this document about what fields you do research in. What is your expertise? How do you describe yourself in a concise manner that someone can really grasp very quickly from reading this document? So I realize that this is something that can cause a lot of panic about thinking, oh, I'm going to have all of these things being evaluated of my document. So we like to joke, kind of thinking about the keep calm and carry on of now panic and freak out. So please don't freak out. We will be kind of going through the expectations of all of the different sections that make up an effective CV today. And remember that there's no such thing as a perfect job candidate. When you look at job postings, these are usually long wish lists of expectations of what they want to see. It's kind of, if they can find someone with all of those attributes and accomplishments, then fantastic. But the reality is that not one part of your CV is really going to make or break your chances on the job market. So what we're going to focus on is just presenting your academic record clearly, but also confidently, so that the reader will know what your strengths are. So moving along into some expectations of how to actually put this document together, we're going to start off by talking about formatting. And as I mentioned, there are some very different discipline expectations for how this document is actually physically put together depending on your field. So to give you a little bit of an example, you can see on the left-hand side an example of a CV from STEM. And if you're not familiar with that acronym, it means science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So really the life and biological sciences, physical sciences area. So you can see an example of what a typical CV would look like for those disciplines on the left-hand side of your screen. Whereas on the right-hand side is an example more appropriate for people with humanities and social sciences background. So again, make sure that you are checking in with people from your discipline, from your field, that can give you some guidelines as to what the expectations are. But hopefully this gives you at least foundational information. So just as an example for the STEM side of things, many people are applying to research intensive positions. And so you can see from that example that research experience is actually on the first page and it's well defined. Whereas for the humanities and social sciences example, professional appointments as well as publications are things that are more important for those disciplines to be front and center on the very first page. So some other formatting considerations is the actual organization of this document. So we do recommend you're going to start off with your name and contact information. If you do already have your PhD, please go ahead and put that credential after your name. But this will include your physical address, phone number, as well as email. You'll want to make sure that the entire document is really consistently formatted. So having evenly spaced sections where the headings and subheadings are clearly marked and delineated. You can see a couple of examples just in these two different documents here of using all caps, having a horizontal line breaking up sections. Basically, we just want to make sure that the reader understands where they are in your document as they're going through it. And then we also want to make sure in terms of formatting that it's consistent, that every section is consistently formatted, so that the dates are always either on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side of the document, but not being switched around. So we are going to pay a little bit more attention today on readability of this document. So even if it doesn't seem as important to you as maybe the actual content of what it gets put into your document, we want to ensure that it can be navigated by the reader as easily as possible. So some other formatting things to consider, the heading for your document really needs to contain, as I mentioned, your full name, address, email, and your phone number. They do like to call you. Every section will need to be clearly delineated, either with lines, spacing, bold, italics, just whatever format you choose, make sure that it is consistent. Every single section needs to be put into reverse chronological order as well. So that means that your current position will be one of the first things that they will see. Margins will also need to be sensible and even. So we recommend not going any smaller than 0.7 inches for all four sides of your CV. Again, there are no page limits for this document for almost any application for an academic position. And so we don't need to squish everything onto one page. So make sure that, again, you're leaving a decent amount of white space, that you have sensible margins. We also want to ensure that the font is readable. So please don't go down any smaller than 11-point font, and make sure that whatever font that you're utilizing, use it for the rest of the application materials. So if you are putting a cover letter in, or if you have a teaching statement or research statement that you're submitting with this document, make sure that all the font, the formatting is consistent between the documents as well. CVs absolutely can contain hyperlinks, but typically in the US, they would be free from color. Keep in mind, however, with hyperlinks that a lot of search committees will actually physically print these out on paper and read through it. So to what degree the hyperlink is helpful is a little bit of a question, but you certainly can put it. What's also quite different about the academic CV here in the US is that it should not contain any biographical details. So no photo, no birth date. They don't need to know where you were born or if you're married or how many children that you have. Your race, ethnicity, your visa status, any of those things should actually not be included on the CV. Now, I realize that different countries have different expectations for this particular information. So again, we're just talking about the US context today. We do also recommend that you save and submit this document as a PDF. And we do so because If anyone uses Word to craft their documents, to revise things, maybe you're sending it to someone else who will give you comments back, you want to make sure that those comments never ever show up when you actually submit that document. I've actually worked with several people who did not submit as a PDF, and my comments that I had given in terms of revisions on their document showed up, and that's quite embarrassing. So go ahead and just make sure that that's not even going to be a potential issue, and save and submit your documents in PDF format. So everything is frozen, everything is clean, and ready to go. So that's some of the formatting basics. I realize that that's pretty quick and pretty broad, but I think as we work into the actual sections of the CV, that there might be some more questions and some more information as to how to put the content together and expectations for best practices. So moving into that, what I'm going to show you next is the traditional list of sections that I see in academic CVs. Now, keep in mind that the discipline that you're from or the type of position that you're applying to, these sections might move around depending on what the job actually wants to see. So I'll work that in a little bit as we talk about this. Again, this is just typical sections found on a CV. These are all examples, so there's really no strict rule about having or not having these sections in a CV, but again, these are the traditional ones that I will see. So as we've already mentioned, having name, contact information. If you do have a professional website, or if you feel particularly comfortable with having your LinkedIn profile here, you could also add a website address. Education section is also a very normal section to see on a CV, and it's usually on the first page no matter what discipline you're from. However, education is only your earned degrees. So if you do have postdoc experience, that's considered training. You don't actually get a degree from that, so it wouldn't be included in that section. So we do recommend having the university name, the degree type, what that concentration was. If it is a master's or PhD where you have a dissertation, to put the title. And for some disciplines, it's expected that you put the name of the advisor or your faculty committee. This would be similar for your undergraduate degree. Many disciplines also will have a section on the first page that can be called a couple of different things. So research interest or areas of expertise. This can also be teaching and research interests, and it's literally just a list. Just a list in a series of research topics, particular areas, or subfields that you are an expert in, that you have or have interest in. So expertise or interest, either one would work. And again, I will be showing examples of most of these sections later on. For any of you that are in the biological or physical sciences or engineering, it is typical to have a research experience section that would actually have a brief description of your research projects. And this would go with starting off with university name first. So again, I'll show you some more examples in a few slides about what this can look like, but this is a section that is pretty typical for most of the scientific areas. For humanities and social sciences, you might forego a research experience section altogether, depending on the expectations of your discipline. Other sections that are very common to see is a teaching experience section with, again, similar formatting. However you format this document in terms of the other sections for order of university first, maybe the department name, you just want to make sure it's consistent for the other sections that have similar styles. This can be an area of including a brief description of your responsibilities or scope of the course. This can also be things like the size of the course, or if it was for an advanced degree or undergraduate audience. Please do not include the course numbers in this section, as no university actually adheres to a universal course numbering system, but absolutely put course titles of courses that you have specifically taught. I have also seen people put pedagogy courses or certificate programs that they have gone through in a teaching experience section, but that could go into a separate section depending again on your field. Sometimes I do see people delineating between grants and fellowships in one section and then honors and awards in another. However, depending on your discipline or even just what you've actually received in these types of categories, this can be one section that you combine. However, for things that are named honors or kind of obscure awards or scholarships, please consider putting some brief context of what that award actually was given for. So as an example, for my PhD, I received the Glenn Bailey Award, which nobody outside of my institution has any idea what that was for. And so for my CV, I have a little bit of a context and a phrase that says awarded for first-year graduate student with excellent potential in mentorship or something like that. So just go ahead and put a little bit of context in the description of those obscure or named fellowships and awards that might not be well known. It is typical to, of course, put an academic service section, and this can kind of be a catch-all for multiple things. If you have been reviewing any manuscripts, volunteering on committees at your university or previous institutions, anything that would fall under service to the institution or university would go into this section. It is also typical to include a list, just a list of your professional affiliations. So if you are a member of a professional society, to put the name of that society as well as the year in which you joined. You usually don't need any more information than that for this section. However, if you have held leadership positions or if you have organized a part of a conference for your professional society, then you would include that information in that section there. Moving on to a few other sections that we do see included. Training, mentoring, and advising experience is, again, a bit of a catch-all. It depends on the type of discipline that you're in, of whether or not it makes sense to put this. For those of you in STEM, I do see people putting a bit of mentoring in kind of combined with a teaching experience section. It is also very typical and expected to see a list of your presentations where you've actually spoken or presented your work. You can delineate between poster or oral presentations or conference versus workshop presentations, so you should include a little bit of detail for that. And then publications are very important to an academic CV and are one of the few sections besides education and your contact information that is universal. So whatever you do, you want to make sure that you're following the expected reference format in your field. We do recommend that you bold your name in the author list so that when people skim through that section, that they can see what level of authorship you have if you are publishing with multiple other authors. You, again, would put this in reverse chronological order, so newest first. And you can note works in progress, so things in preparation or that have been submitted or revised. You can use subheadings, or you can just put, a little bit of an asterisk or parentheses afterwards to delineate that information. There are a whole bunch of other types of sections that we sometimes see in academic CVs. More and more I'm seeing people put a short technical skills section, but this can also be related work experience, public scholarship, languages that you speak. And then at the very end of an academic CV, when you're actually sending it in for an application, you would put your references at the very last section. So this would include the full mailing address, email, and phone number of your references. So who's actually going to be writing letters on your behalf. So I know that that was a pretty quick overview of the main sections of an academic CV. Now what I'm going to do is show you some examples of the main sections and how to actually format them so they work for you. And we do have a couple of differences between the different disciplines as well. So as you can see for education section on this slide, the top portion is a humanities and social sciences example with the dates that are left aligned. You can see the dissertation title as well as the committee and some of the specialties as well. For the bottom example, this is from the life sciences, formatted just a little bit differently with your dates on the right-hand side. And again, it's up to you for how you put this together, just as long as it is consistent throughout the entire document as to where your dates are. So these are some examples of the education section. It's pretty straightforward. Again, this is only earned degrees, and it is typical to put your laboratory, if you're in STEM, who your advisor was, or your faculty mentors for any of your other disciplines. Another typical section to include is something to tell them about your research experience or your teaching experience. So for those of you who are in the humanities and social sciences, you may actually just have this first section, and that might be it. Just the list of your interests, areas of expertise, or overall topical competencies. However, for those of you in the STEM fields, you can see on the bottom example that we have areas of expertise pretty similar to the one above it. However, for research experience, you might have more in-depth description. So in the case for most of the life and physical sciences, a publications list alone is not sufficient enough to convey the type of work that you are doing. So as you can see in this example here, that each experience that you have should have brief bullet pointed descriptions. And if you think of each bullet point like just one overall project or one large aspect of a project, that might be a good way of thinking about how you craft this. We also want to make sure that we're not putting too much jargon in this section if you are describing your research experiences. It needs to be broadly understandable by other types of scientists because it's hard to really anticipate who's going to be reading this document, and we want them to be able to get a pretty good grasp of who you are and what your main research focuses have been. You can include internships or undergraduate experience in this section. Again, it just needs to be academic experience. That's the only kind of barometer for whether or not it should go in the CV. If it goes, it has to be academic. And we have underlined in this section some of the starting off the bullet points with active verbs. So this is the recommended way of putting this section together. So as you can see, just in this one section of an academic CV, there's pretty wide variance for the type of discipline that you're in. So again, check with your advisor and other people in your field for expectations. The next section that is incredibly important for many people is teaching experience. And I actually have 3 different examples to show you today for people with different types of backgrounds. For those of you who have a lot of teaching experience or you're applying to a teaching intensive position, then teaching experience might actually come earlier in your document, something that would be on the first page for a reader to see. So for those of you who are in those types of teaching intensive fields, especially those in the humanities and social sciences, you might have a section like what's up here on the screen. So still having action-oriented bullet points, just like we showed in the previous slide for research experience, but you can include some quantification as appropriate for your field. We do have an example here of a writing intern, which is something that the University of Chicago is kind of known for. I would say that the length of information is just a little bit too much. There's too much detail in this particular section, so we want to keep the focus on the most impressive teaching experiences. So the fact that this person was a lecturer multiple times, I would expect a little bit more emphasis on that rather than the writing internship as an example. This example also shows you how to put together a description of pedagogical training. So the Little Red Schoolhouse or the Chicago Center for Teaching here on campus offer pedagogical training. It really shows that you care about teaching in a way that you have gone the extra step. And so thinking about if you have that experience, how do you concisely bring it into your CV and make sure that that is emphasized to the reader. Now this example has a decent amount of descriptive bullet points. Not every discipline has this expectation. So this example here might be a bit more appropriate depending on the type of field that you're in. This is probably more similar to people in the humanities fields that I typically see. So you want to make sure that you're including in your teaching experience section things like if you were an instructor, if you were a lecturer, guest or otherwise, if you were an assistant to something or a writing intern. All of these experiences, they absolutely do count to showing that you have extensive teaching experience. We want to make sure that we're not kind of padding it with things that are a little bit different, however. We also want to make sure that we translate terms that might be a little bit more something that we'd see in UChicago, but might not be as understandable or known outside of this particular academic institution. So translating things like preceptor into undergraduate thesis, seminar, instructor, or something like that. So just making sure that the jargon that you're using is accessible by an audience that has not been trained just at the University of Chicago. As I mentioned previously, when we were kind of going through very quickly all of the various sections of a traditional CV, please don't include the course numbers. They actually don't translate to any other institution except for where you actually taught those courses. But please use the course name. So in this example, you can see Teaching Intern, History of European Civilization 1, circa 1000 to 1700. So putting the course titles is absolutely something you should be doing, but no course numbers at this particular stage. I have seen people delineate of whether or not this was an undergraduate course or if it was for something for an upper graduate division or things like that. In addition, we have a third example here, especially for many scientists. You don't always have an opportunity to actually teach. I know for my PhD program, we actually had absolutely 0 TA-ships that I needed to do, so I didn't have any traditional teaching experience. So what that means is that you can kind of combine teaching and mentorship or other types of things that you've done. So in this example, you can see some ways of communicating about mentorship in the various bullet points that are here. You don't need all of this detail, but just so you see other examples of how to put this section together. So mentoring and tutoring absolutely does count. You can be specific in including those types of experiences and also putting things like the course names, similar to other teaching experience sections that we've looked at, and consider specifying if you actually were involved in course development. This is not always the norm for people that have teaching experience. So if you have done that, please explain and put that context in here. You also can put some numbers, so how many people were you teaching, how many people did you mentor, as other ways of kind of adding to the description and impact of this particular section. Another section is service or academic service. So as I mentioned previously, this is a catch-all type of section. It can include a lot of different types of experiences. It all just depends on what you've been doing outside of your actual program itself. So in these examples, you can see some very distinct differences. So the top one shows that this person was part of a public affairs committee. They also were involved with a planning committee for the postdoc association. They were an ombuds person. And they have a little bit of description there as well. So contextualizing the example, the experience, so people know what you actually did. The second example on this slide is very straightforward. It's just kind of what the role you had, what institution it was, and what the organization was. So this can be a catch-all section for a lot of things. Sometimes people will put mentorship here, but any type of academic service that would be committee work, organizing events or workshops, doing any type of revisions would be acceptable to put into an academic service section. Now, depending on your discipline, publications might come much earlier. As I said earlier in this workshop for humanities and social sciences, you might have your publications on the very first page of your academic CV. However, for most people in the life and physical sciences, you'll have publications much closer to the very end of the document, actually. So go ahead and just choose whatever citation style is the most common of your field. You can even look at well-respected journals for how they cite the different papers and use the same thing. You can also have subsections to highlight stages of the publication process or different types of publication types. So this could be the differences between peer-reviewed articles versus books or book chapters or review articles. We also have the delineation of kind of the stages of the publication process, because that does take a really long time. So delineating between if it is actually published versus in submission or under review, or even if it's just in preparation. Now, as a note, for any papers that you list that are in submission or under review, we do recommend that you don't include the journal name as you're putting that reference together. The reason being is that, even for someone like me, I've been out of research for 5 years now. I could submit something to a very well-respected journal in my field today, but that doesn't mean that I would get accepted. So we don't ever know that a publication is going to absolutely be accepted and published. So for things that are in submission and review, just go ahead and leave the journal name off, but please include the title of whatever that paper is. This section only includes work that was bound for an academic audience. So if you are of a discipline that has work for a wide variety of other types of audiences, then you would consider a separate section that would delineate those types of experiences and accomplishments. And again, if you do have multiple authors on any publications you're listing, please bold your name in the author list so that someone who is just skimming through the document can quickly see where you are within that list. And finally, references. This is typically the very last section on an academic CV, and it really needs to include quite a bit of detail actually about whoever is going to be writing you letters or will give you an actual recommendation. So this needs to have the formal name of whoever that person is with their degrees at the end of their name, and their full title. So a lot of professors have very special professorships, named professorships. So you want to make sure that you're including all of that detail as you list them in your CV. This will include their mailing address, an email address, and phone number. So you do want to include their office phone number, obviously not their personal cell phone, but their office phone number so that they can pick up the phone and they can call that reference immediately. It's typical to include a minimum of 3 references on an academic CV as you are sending it in for an application, but this can be expanded depending on what type of position you're applying for. And it can be tailored depending on that position. So for example, if you are applying to something that's very service oriented, then you might consider including a reference on this list that can speak to your involvement in doing academic service at your institution. So those are the best practices for the very traditional sections, expectations for this document. As I've mentioned multiple times now, sorry to kind of beat this drum a little bit, but please check in with people in your field to ensure that you're following discipline-specific conventions. We also want to ensure that you are changing the order of your document depending on your the type of position you're applying for, but also because of your discipline. So if you were applying to something that is very teaching intensive, you would actually move teaching experience much earlier in the document. If you were applying to something that is research intensive, then you want research experiences much earlier in the document. So just follow the guidelines that the jobs are actually asking for in terms of the types of positions and the requirements and kind of responsibilities of that job. So some very brief final steps before we open it up for Q&A is to really review some of these best practices. So making sure to arrange those sections, as I was just talking about, in order of importance. So tailor it. Move the sections around depending on what the institution values. And you can glean that from the job post itself, but also from conversations that you may have had or just things that you know about that particular institution. University of Chicago, especially for many of the fields, it's very much a focus on your research productivity, whereas applying to a small liberal arts college, they're going to be much more interested in your teaching experience and showing that you have been productive in that way. So you might want to develop different CVs for different types of applications. We also want to make sure that if you have distinguishing characteristics or unique things about who you are or accomplishments that you've had, that we make sure that they stand out. So don't bury them in the document. So if there are recognizable awards or journals, the fact that you have training from the University of Chicago, we need to make that something that a reader can easily find as they're just skimming through this document. So one test to make sure that this is coming out is to give your academic CV to someone who is a friend or maybe a family member, and asking them, give them 2 minutes to look it over and say, what are the main things that come out from reading my expertise? Kind of what do you remember the most about how I'm communicating about myself as a researcher and as a teacher? You can be granular in the types of categories to bring both order and to focus attention on different types of experiences. So again, this depends on what type of experience you've had, but delineating between book chapters or peer-reviewed articles versus being an actual instructor of a course versus a teaching assistant. There's kind of a different level of value that might be given in your discipline depending on those different experiences. And then make sure that you are considering who's actually going to read the document. So if there are unfamiliar terms that are maybe very specific to your discipline or very specific to the University of Chicago, make sure that you're translating that so that someone understands the type of position you actually did have. So some very final steps for academic CVs is to share the document. As you're putting it together, make sure that other people read this. This can be previous mentors, advisors, or asking other recent alums or people in your field to give you some overall feedback about how this document is communicating who you are. Make sure that your sections are clear, concise, and also consistent through all of the categories. So if you pick one particular formatting style, just make sure it's consistent through the rest of the document. We don't want the reader to get frustrated or annoyed because you've used 3 different fonts and your dates are in different locations for the different sections. Again, let's just make this as easy for them to navigate as possible. One other tool that can be useful is actually to proofread using a text-to-speech function. So there are some programs online that you can literally just listen to how the document reads as you've typed it, but making sure to proofread multiple times. As you have a good solid draft of the document, put it away for a day and then come back to it. Make sure that you have some space so that you can ensure that all of the grammatical errors, formatting, how you're describing your experiences are as clear and correct as possible. And as I mentioned previously, convert all your documents at the end when they're done, ready to go, into a PDF format so that you can submit with all of those changes completely frozen and polished in your document. So that's all I have for everyone today. I'm very happy to take questions for the next 15 minutes. Feel free to reach out to me by email. I do have my email address listed here on the very final presentation slide, as well as if anyone is on LinkedIn and wants to connect with me, I'd be very happy to connect with you on that format. So if you do have any specific questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat box and we'll make sure to answer them now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Briana. That was very helpful and very, very detailed. The first question we have for you is, what advice would you have to tailoring your CV if you were trying to switch areas of study?
Absolutely. That's an excellent question. So I think part of it will be for the academic CV, you might be a little bit limited in how much you can kind of change that around because, again, your training is what it is. However, I think one excellent section to change or to kind of adjust a little bit is if you are putting a research interest or areas of expertise list at the very first page of your document, it typically goes right underneath education section, then you can bring in some of those other disciplinary areas that you are trying to switch into. So maybe your degree is in one particular thing, but what you're listing for your areas of expertise might reflect where you're going. So areas of interest perhaps is a better way of labeling that section. I would also consider if there are particular experiences that you have had that are a bit more in line with where you think you'd like to go, to make sure that you have fleshed out the description as appropriate for your discipline for those types of experiences so that they stand out a little bit further.
Thank you. How often do you recommend refreshing your CV, and what is the best practice for keeping that a routine?
Sure. So that is, yeah, managing these documents and managing actually updating them is a practice I think everybody can be better at. You know, it's easier if you have a working doc somewhere easily accessible on your desktop, that as you have maybe new articles that you're published or new experiences that you've had, or another presentation or workshop that you've been able to give, that you can update that in a, you know, at least in an accessible way. So as an example, I actually keep my CV in a folder, and I try, like, right on my desktop. It's not buried in multiple levels of folders, so at least it kind of reminds me to see that I have a folder labeled CV and resumes on my desktop to kind of jog my memory every once in a while. So that's a small trick. Another thing would just be in terms of how often to update it, besides kind of when you actually have new things that you can add. I would say checking in maybe quarterly, every couple of months, or at least twice a year. Again, academic accomplishments take a long time, so you want to just make sure that you're doing it a few times a year to update and refresh the document as appropriate.
Thank you. If I wanted to find examples of CVs in specific disciplines, what are good resources for finding example CVs?
Sure. So a little bit of answering that question kind of depends on what you're trying to do with your document. But I would say one of the best things that you can do is most faculty members will have their academic CVs listed on a professional website, on their academic website. And so what I would actually tell people is to look at people who have transitioned to faculty positions in the last couple of years. So people who are assistant professors or maybe just received tenure, so that you can see some of the expectations of those documents, but for people who have been on the job market more recently. The job market has changed, the expectations for these documents have changed. So looking at someone who is, you know, a tenured professor who has 30 plus years in the field, it's great to see what they've done, but they probably haven't applied for a job in quite a long time. And so how they're putting their CV together might actually not be as modernized as it should be for someone going on the job market these days. So looking on current assistant professor faculty positions, most of them have a link to their CV. That's probably the best resource that I would recommend for seeing disciplinary information, and again, more relevant, timely, and appropriate ways of putting this document together.
Great, and we have one last one for this time. If I am applying to jobs that are not specifically within academia, should I send a CV? When is it appropriate to send a CV?
That's a great question. So an academic CV, again, within the US context is, you know, outside of academic positions, I think the only other things that might be appropriate are, well, you know, research organizations. There are some kind of think tanks and research organizations like that. So, but outside or government positions, though they have a completely different subset of how you put that together on a government application. But outside of that, usually it's expected that you're going to put a resume together, and a resume is a very different document. It's much more tailored to every position that you apply to, and it's also incredibly short. So for some fields, that means literally just one page. So I would actually recommend, if anyone is interested, to go to the website that's linked at the bottom of this screen. grad.uchicago.edu is my office's website. We have a career development tab that has a variety of presentations, handouts, and examples for resumes, but also for academic positions. So that would be another resource to check into if you want to convert your CV into a 1 to 2 page resume, because for most positions, you're actually not going to be using a CV any longer outside of academia.
Wonderful. Thank you, Briana. On that note, we are going to end today's session to be mindful of everyone's time. We will be sharing this recording. I know there was a lot of very useful information that I hope you'll be able to use and take away and revisit as you're building out your CV for the first time or updating it. So thank you for everyone to participating, and a special thank you to Briana for sharing this very helpful information, and to the Office of UChicago Grad. As Briana mentioned, it is an excellent resource, so please feel free to visit that website as well. We do have 2 more sessions for the Young Alumni Career Series. So Wednesday, August 28th, we have tips and strategies for applying to graduate school, and then Public Speaking 101, conveying your message with confidence, on September 11th. Please visit our events page at careers.uchicagoalumni.org for our most up-to-date schedule of events. Take care, and please have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks so much for joining us.